A very good morning to one and all. On behalf of the Center for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at Impact and Policy Research Institute, Terry School of Advanced Studies, and India Water Portal, I extend my warm welcome to you to the episode 6 of the State of the Environment #Planet Talks with me, Simi Mehta. Climate change is any change that is occurring on Earth's climate, either permanently or even lasting for a longer period of time. Natural climate change has occurred throughout the existence of this planet, and it has been reported by climate scientists that we may currently be anywhere near to another ice age. However, what is a worrying trend since the past 2 to 3 centuries, the Industrial Revolution to be very precise, is the anthropogenic factors that have hastened the natural warming processes of the Earth and the glacial advances that are ultimately spiking its temperatures. Added reasons are burning of fossil fuels, aerosols being released in the atmosphere at an increased rate, land alterations through deforestation and for agricultural purposes, and of course, for industrialization. The implications of the anthropogenic climate change are visible through temperatures rising, through sea levels rising, fast melting of glaciers, and increased incidences of extreme events like floods, droughts, hurricanes, ocean acidification, etc. What is not often visible is, or even ignored, is the negative impact on the lives, on the society by affecting its vulnerable groups. For example, women, children, elderly, and also the transgender community. In fact, scholars very recently came out, scholars at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology at Pune very recently came out of a report, with a report that increasing temperatures in the country are alarming. And this is a 2020 report. If business as usual approach continues, by the turn of the 21st century, we'll see the average temperatures in India rising to approximately 4.4 degrees Celsius than the present rate, implying that the country will become increasingly unlivable. This would further mean that the vulnerable groups just cited before would increase, their sufferings would increase. To gain insights on various perspectives on climate change, society, and gender in India, we have with us Professor Sucharita Sen, professor in the Center for the Study of Regional Development at the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Sen was a Fulbright Nehru Fellow at The Ohio State University in Columbus, USA. She has been the head of the South Asia Consortium for Interdisciplinary Water Resources Study in Hyderabad. Professor Sen is a noted economic geographer and has published both nationally and internationally in the areas of agriculture, natural resources, rural livelihoods, labor, gender, water, and societal spaces, and societal aspects of climate change in rural as well as in peri-urban spaces. Professor Sen is a passionate teacher and has supervised over 50 MPhil and PhD students. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us today. It is our pleasure to have you this morning. I now invite you to make your presentation. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. Can I share my screen now?
Yes, please.
So is this visible?
Yes. If you could do it on a slideshow mode.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being associated with Arjun, Simi, all of you. I mean, now I think it's always very, very nice to, see our students doing so well. So what I will try to do, I've tried to do something which I have found it difficult myself. So there are, so the first part, what I'm going to do is flag some generic issues about climate change and link with society and gender. So, and these are generic, can be treated at a global level, at a country level, at a regional level, and at local levels. Post that, the main part of my presentation, what I'm going to do is draw heavily from two of the work I've been associated with. One, when I was in JNU and the field work was conducted between 2013 and 2015 in Himachal Himalayas, near a place called Udaipur. There were two glaciers which we were working on, and there was the scientific team which had scientists and social scientists, so physical geographers and social. So I was looking at the social side and the agriculture side, and we were trying to wed the scientific and the social data. So that's one work. The other work I'm going to draw heavily upon is what I have, that is why I've written formally Director Saki Waters, because this is a work I've done in Saki Waters, which was, the work was called Genderscape of Brahmaputra. So this had a very different kind of a question, because the former was absolutely linked with climate change, the latter was not. So the latter was, it aimed at bringing up gender relations along the river Brahmaputra, but how I've been able to use it is that flood was the axis through which a lot of the gender relations were looked at. So I've tried to bring these two together, and I am putting forward what I call as propositions, because they are actually findings, but I'm trying to make a somewhat general statement. But since this may not be applicable to all other micro contexts, I'm calling them propositions. So I'm bringing up 9 propositions, or you can call it lessons learned, which I've learned from these two studies. I've also tangentially brought in 2 other work for a small part. That is, the first is the Gender Atlas, which I've done with 2 of my colleagues here, which was mapping, gender variables across districts in India, and using many data sources for that. So little bit of that. And the 4th thing I've drawn upon is the last section I do on policies. So this was also work done in Saki Waters, a small part of that work, which was done on climate change in an urban context on cooperation and conflict. So this was a multi-country partnership, but this is the work I'm presenting is something I personally have done. So these are the 4 things from which I will draw upon. Now, the first question, which I think, I will be interchangeably talking about climate change, disasters, extreme climatic events, etc. Now, when we say natural disasters, I think we need to question first and foremost as to how natural are these natural disasters. And it's not only from the perspective of what is the cause, because we very well know that the kind of climate, as Simi was pointing out, the climate change that we are looking at is rooted strongly in the path of development that has been followed at the global level. But also, many of the so-called natural disasters have intersected with, sometimes it is this broader paradigm of development which is impacted. Sometimes it actually intersects with the local space and the management of the space. Say, for example, the Hyderabad floods, which we saw just now, the Chennai flood some years back. All of this, many of these things would not have happened if the management of the city was a little different. So it intersects with that, and not just a larger model of development. And the third thing, which is not natural, is the natural disaster. If we use this term, it gives us the sense that it is something we cannot stop, and it'll uniformly impact everybody. This is far from true. There's a lot of work which is being done on this. So these are the different aspects. Now, the literature insofar as climate change is concerned is on, so the first thing I want to say is that there's a vast literature on climate change. However, what I feel is that after having gone through at least some part of that, my observation is that there is a parallel way in which the science of climate change literature and the social science of climate change literature proceeds. These two things have to be brought together, and some of these I hopefully I will be able to throw up with my own work. You know, when we talk, so in terms of the themes, mitigation, preparedness, response or adaptation, and recovery. These are the 4 themes which are there. And even though some of them are not really have to be done in the local context, my problem with some of the literature is that it is very, very top down, and it inadequately engages the macro and the micro, which I think is extremely important. Now, there is now an urgency, and I'm going to talk about COVID, though there is no scientific way to suggest, but I was looking at some of the recent, in fact, 2 of the recent scientific papers which have come up, and they state, I mean, of course, to be validated, a lot more work needs to be done, that 2 things. One is that it is the factors which are influencing climate change are very often the similar factors which are giving rise to this increased incidence of disease, which are having a tendency to become pandemics. Now we are living through one which is like historic. And it's completely turned all our lives upside down. And so climate change, one of the papers actually state that the climate change is influencing evolution of organisms in a way that is giving rise to human diseases, and the globalized economic regime is translating it into epidemics and pandemics, because we are our contact has become very, very frequent. So when there are 2 elements of climate change, and one is the slow change in temperature, but that is what has been, I mean, rainfall has also been talked about, other elements, but temperature, as Simi was mentioning, is one of the primary focus. So one is this slow change towards a different regime, but then when we go to the field and talk to people, they find it harder to associate with that, because it is a slow change and there are other things which are changing in their life. So it's impossible for them to actually separate the climate change element and the other changes. So I am going to actually elaborate that through my examples. But the second thing is a short-term extreme event. So what we are seeing, the Amphan, the, different, I mean, we have so many, within the pandemic only, we've seen so many extreme events in our country itself. So the Kerala flood was a little earlier, but all of them are kind of, are clubbed together. It's just you have to, that is on your face now. So the latter might be short term, but what we are realizing now, that this frequency of these events actually manages to shock the society for a very long time, shocks to economy, shocks to livelihood and recovery. So even though this event is sudden and lasts for 3, 4, 5 days, the recoveries which you are looking at multiplied with the situation of COVID. And even if it was not for the COVID, it will take much longer to come back to the steady state. So this is the second point. And so the third point I've already mentioned. Now, I want to talk about climate justice and inequality a little bit. And I mean, climate change is a justice issue, at least for 3 reasons. First, that the causes are driven by social inequality. So the most politically, culturally, economically marginalized communities and nations use vastly less fossil fuel based energy. So 75% of the carbon emission comes from the global north, which accounts for only 15% of the population. Now the same, since I brought in COVID in this, the same thing. You track as to how COVID has come. I mean, there are memes about it, that where the, if you remember the red zone and the green zones in the first kind of maps that we had in India, it is all the places which are rich, which are highly connected, which are globalizing, where there is a higher incidence of, well-off people. So they are the ones who are traveling globally. Those were the ones who brought the thing in, whereas to bear the cost of it, it was much more difficult for those who were marginalized. So this is a kind of, the causes are driven by social inequalities is the first point I wish to make. The second is the impacts of climate change are unequally felt by the rich and the poor, and the disparate impacts will continue to increase in future generations. So what happens is that if we are buying in this proposition that the short-term events have a very long-term effect, there is a cyclical way in which there is a downward spiral of the poor. So the current gap tends to increase, among other things, also with the current model of development, which we are looking at, but is enhanced by the way they are impacted by climate change events. Third, the policies are designed to manage climate change have starkly unequal consequences, and the processes by which emission reductions and climate adaptation policies are decided tend to exclude the poor and powerless. Some of it I will talk about in Indian context at the very end. So this is a phrase that is very often used, but I think it is also apt for climate justice and inequality. It's an issue of socializing the cost and privatizing the benefits. Through these 3 points, that's what I see. So the social and economic identities, all of us know this. So the usual category would be class, including income and consumption, and also access to means of production. Caste, ethnicity, particularly caste in our country, even though I do not talk about it, I have not been able to, I have, but I have not brought it up in this. In Brahmaputra work, caste came in somewhat. Ethnicity, religion also I'm not touching upon, but generically gender and space, which we very often forget, and space. So there are these intersections of all of this, and I think so far as climate change is concerned, why I've put space in red is that space, the local context and the local space tend to always intersect with one or more of these social and economic identities. So these intersectionalities are something in which I talk about in terms of gender also. They are something which is not just that if you have two deprived, suppose you are a Dalit woman who's living in a very, say cyclone prone area. So you have three axes through which you are marginalized. So it's just not more of the same. It is a qualitatively different lived experience. Hopefully I'll be able to bring this up when I am sharing my work. And when local contexts are considered, since you are talking about the international climate change policy issues at the global level, then the local context might be the country. When you are talking at the country level, the local context might be the state. When you're talking at the state, so there are different kind of scales involved, and this is how one should actually look at it. Having said that, the micro local contexts are extremely important, and the two of the work that I am looking at or drawing upon are based on completely local context or a micro context. A little bit about gender and climate change. Now there are two, if you look at the literature at large, women are in the global north. There are two sets of generalization. One is in the global north, one is in the global south. So the global north generalization is women are portrayed as closer to nature and more environmentally conscious than their male counterparts. So there are male polluters and women do not pollute, and they're the stewards of sustainable means of livelihood. So this is one generalization which is done. The second, the global south generalization is women are poorer and more vulnerable to natural hazards and they suffer more. Now, while both of these might have some truth in it. So the former one has ecofeminism, which has come out of it. I mean, feminism is rooted not only in the global north, but global south experiences also. But I really feel things are much more complex than these two sets of generalization. And this, if you actually, accept this, then you are not addressing the power imbalances and not bringing it to the agenda. So the insistence that women's universal vulnerability, at least for the developing part of the world, can have an opposite effect, or can have a disempowering effect of making gender invisible in the debates of climate change, since you assume that they're vulnerable, they're poor, they're divorced from knowledge base and so on and so forth. They will never come into. So what has happened in the development program, say if you take up the internationally funded drinking water food program, with some of which I'm a little, aware about, you would see that there is an unequal responsibility and burden put on the women, but not the power to decide which way the thing should go, but you expect them to participate and implement what you are asking them. So there is a double burden of the policy now on this. So this is one of the, so it also denies them the agency while constructing women's vulnerability as specific problem. I hope I'll be able to talk about agency with some examples. And in doing this, it reinforces the difference between women and men as given and unchangeable. So while part of this might be true, it's not true in its entirety, number one. Number two, I think we have to have a much more nuanced way of understanding the gendered considerations in climate change. And it is far more complex than these two simplistic notions. So I have already talked about this. I'll skip it. I mean, there are these three sets of work that I have drawn from. The two fieldwork work, which I am currently now, my next part will be dependent on that, is one is Himachal Himalaya, and we have worked on two glaciers, the Gangstang Glacier and the Menthosa Glacier, and we were looking at the glacier and the water discharge and the downstream agricultural community, which is the work which I was involved in. I could not finish it as I moved to Saki Waters, but what I'm showing you is the data I have analyzed. The other thing is this Brahmaputra Basin, where we did field work with a large team, but I myself was in the field for a long time. It includes Bhutan. Within India, it includes Arunachal Pradesh, Upper Assam, Middle Assam, Lower Assam, and Bangladesh. Bangladesh, I haven't done the field myself, but the other places I've been there, but there were a lot of other people who also helped with the field work. So let me put forward a stylized chain of events, which is very simplistic, but why I'm doing this is that I am going to speak on some of these elements. So one is that the impact of climate change, as we have agreed that it is differentiated, even times, space scales are different. There could be positive and negative effects. There could be slow and abrupt effect. Now, depending on what kind of change we are feeling or the people are feeling, perceptions will be developed. These perceptions are should not be just thrown aside saying that, oh, that this is just people's perception, which is where I think science and social science need to have a common language. And because the adaptation, which again science embraces, are really based on the perceptions. So the perceptions of the event the perception of the risk and the opportunity which the event is providing to your livelihood. I think this is the key thing. So it's not only perception of the climate change event, but if, say, for example, I'm sitting in an AC room and I'm able to do all my work, it is not disturbing me, I will have a perception that the things have become hotter, but don't expect me to go into adaptation because I'm not really feeling it. So then there is a perceived adaptive capacity. So what kind of, there's also perception about my own or my community's adaptive capacity. Now this intersects with the actual adaptive capacity, which would have several factors: how much finance you have access to, how much skill you have access to, the technology, infrastructure, the social network, and so on and so forth. There is this 5 pentagon, which is there in the DFID framework, which talks about shock and climate change on sustainable rural livelihoods framework. So I'm putting it a little bit differently. And then you have the actual adaptation. The adaptation to what? This is a main question. Do you adapt to climate change directly, or do you adapt to the livelihood threats? So that's one of the key findings that we came up with, that you really don't adapt to climate change itself, because that's just a means to the end. Who adapts? Who can adapt? Who adapts? Who has the agency to adapt? Who's facilitating the process? The government, the other formal institutions, informal institutions, and what are the processes which are there? Then you would have a success of adaptation, the degree to which the risk was averted, or it may be maladaptation, you have not been able to adapt, or degree to which the opportunities were availed. So there could be, we have come across some examples where it threw up farmers some opportunities to the kind of climate change which was going on, which would again feed into your impact of climate change. So if you have had a successful adaptation, and this I feel can only be done if institutions at all the multi-scalar level can work in perfect consonance, which never happens, then only you would find a significant change. And I'm not talking about mitigation here. Mitigation is a different thing which we must do at the side. So this is about impact and adaptation, since I'm talking about the local context. So what I do now, I form 9 propositions, and these propositions are drawn from these 2 studies by and large, and the gender atlas a little bit, this first proposition. And why I'm calling it proposition is that they are actually findings so far as the studies are concerned. Sometimes in a proposition I quote both the studies, sometimes I quote one of the other. But why is it a proposition? Is these are after all 2 studies at 2 very micro level. So one doesn't know whether it will apply to the rest of the local context, but I think it is a useful debating point, and therefore I'm calling it proposition. So the first proposition I'm talking about is that the climate change debate has to start from access to resources, and the fact that social relationships are intertwined, for the spelling error, entwined with the spatial context or the resource element. So what I'm giving you an example of, I'm trying to sketch a genderscape through maps where I'll try and explain you the rationale of that. So this can actually, and I'll also give you one of the examples from the genderscape study on the line of class, where the access to resource is extremely important. So this is from the Gender Atlas. All these maps are from Gender Atlas. What you see is the larger gender vulnerability index, and I'm not making a point here, I'm just making a broader point that, and if you look at many other maps also, access to land, percentage of cultivators, and so on and so forth, you will see that there is a north-south divide. Now in this map, of course, the desert and Gujarat comes, but by and large, what you do see is that the Indo-Gangetic plain, and this is the point I'm trying to make, which has been historically a fertile land, that has very low. So the lighter the color, the more adverse is the gender gap. of the index that we are talking about. So the Indo-Gangetic plain, which has been historically a fertile land, there has been less of male selective outmigration. There has been more control over the land has been productive. Those are the places where you have seen much more adverse gender relations, which is being expressed through these quantitative numbers. Now, if you look at the Brahmaputra Valley, and we have only Assam to talk about here, you also see this is not very clear, but within Assam, the valley region is lighter color compared to the hill region, which are outside where also the river flows. And so in contrast, in the hills, or areas which are rugged, which have low agricultural productivity, has historically been an area of male selective outmigration. Women have taken over the agriculture. The control of land has not been such a central issue or a pivoting issue where the gender relations, I'm not saying that, and I'll give you examples where there are nuances within the hill region also, but at least what you see is that you say work-wise, if you look at the women and work, they are completely visible, and that's societally, that's acceptable norm in the society. Whereas in the plain or the valley region, the norms are much more restrictive. And they are, and in fact, when the river goes to Bangladesh, of course, you are having another change of religion here, but also the river valley. You also see this continuing and becoming more restrictive, even though over a period of time, Bangladesh has improved a lot. So there are, no matter what you take up, even those indicators where, the government has a role. So for example, percentage of rural area households having treated water sources within the premises. There is no earthly reason why this should be lower in the valley region where there is a regressive gender this thing, but this just goes on to show, and this is not the only indicator. This is percentage of government schools, ratio of male to female literacy rates everywhere. In different degree, you see that the valley region is more adverse, even when it is not to do directly with the social norm, but this is only goes to say that your social norm, religious norms actually is the government institution have this embedded in them. So many of the legal provisions, for example, used to, minus the recent changes, used to draw upon the religious norms which were established. So there is a continuity in the way that the societal norms would function, and that is visible within the institutional norms. Another example which I would like to give from this genderscape, that only one point, maybe I'll be running out of time, but so Brahmaputra is a river, particularly in the plains, the Assam plains, I'm talking about that, has flood as an annual event, and it is something which destabilizes people year after year, even though they've adapted quite well. So the only point which I wish to make here, that when we did our fieldwork, what we observed was only the poorest of the poor have stayed back close to the river because they did not have the means to move out. So if they had, they would have moved out. And these are all, there is a caste element here, caste and ethnicity element here. The tribes have voluntarily stayed with the river, but the larger Hindu society, if you say, and the caste within that, the upper caste and who are also richer have moved very much away, either to urban area or to rural areas which do not have the flood. So this is one thing which was very clearly observable in the entirety of Assam where flood is there. So what I'm trying to say is the resource and the relationship of the societal structure. The first I gave the example of gender relations, and now I'm giving you an example of economic and other social axes like caste and tribes, that it has something to do with how resources are allocated, or people have mobility or no mobility, and so on and so forth. Proposition 2, livelihood decisions are based. Now, where is climate change in this? For the most part, people are vulnerable. I was hearing Ashish Kothari's talk are organized by all of you, and he very rightly points out that he elaborates the kind of inequality which we are seeing now in our society. So the majority of the people are living on a threshold, and livelihood decisions therefore is based on profitability and not on climatic considerations. So at an existence at the threshold, which is true of the majority, sustainable practices are only notional for people on ground. This is my second proposition. Even in a cold desert area, and I'm giving you the example of Himachal, which is a very kind of a homogeneous society, there is not too much of inequality even there. So I will just give you some example that there is, potatoes or peas are, potato and peas are, diversified crops which is produced for commercial purposes. Potatoes, they've started in 70s. Peas are very recent, post 90s. Now they're changing to other vegetables. But when we researched, you can see that almost, and these were the traditional crops, which are very resilient to many kind of climate changes, and these are not. So I have given you an idea of the profitability here, which are not very well calculated and exact, but you can see that they're very, very different for these three things. So you have 14,762 for peas, for potato, 9,700 for the gross return per biga, and this is per 3 years, so 6161 is good. The next one which is there, the other ones are not even there, so they've just disappeared, which was done for self-consumption. On the other hand, no matter where we went and who we asked, everybody felt that commercialization is a risky proposition. So it's not as if they are not saying, of course, they don't identify this totally with the climate change, but they have very sharp perceptions about climate change. So you will see, this is the number of people who say that snowfall, these are the first elements which they have. So snowfall, in fact, is the most primary element in given the region that we were talking about. So what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make is that the perceptions of all these other things are quite sharp. Sometimes 80% of the people have said that, yes, it has changed. But in spite of that, they are engaging in a practice which is driven by profitability and other elements like road connectivity, better infrastructure development, etc. And even though they see risk in it, that's what they have completely shifted to. So that is proposition number 2. Proposition number 3, perceptions are central to adaptation and willingness to adapt, but perceptions very often do not match the scientific data. And this is something we should really be, and we should not, this doesn't mean that we throw out the perception, because if you don't have the perception based, if I don't perceive that, I need to do something, all the adaptation measures which might come as a top-down approach from the government or other institutions will completely fail. So we really have to engage with this. So I just want to tell you that, we had asked the people for the last 10 years thing. So I'm just giving you an example. This is the annual discharge data, which we see that the maximum, minimum and average, and this was done by a scientific team, Professor Milap Chand Sharma and Professor Shrikesh. So they saw that there is a decline in discharge. However, the part of the work which I was doing when we asked whether there is a change in perception of water availability for agriculture, the answer was a resounding no. We did 5 villages. No matter where you went, more than 80% of the people said that there is no change felt. So it could be because of the snow melt, the snow was melting, the discharge might be lower. There is some evidence of drying of wells, which they did not see as something which is major in their lives, or it is changing the kind of cultivation that they want to do. So at least they felt no change. So this is an important lesson. Proposition 4. It's often not clear whether adaptation is a response to climate change. It is a response to livelihood risks, and very often climate is only one of the factors which influences it. So when we constantly talk about climate change adaptation, climate change actions, climate sensitive behavior, we have to remember this, because ultimately people are really looking at how their livelihoods is going. So in this unlikely event like a flood, where you are very clear that the flood is the only reason why your crops have drowned and your livestock has died, other than that, the slow kind of a climate change is really not the reason to which people adapt. People adapt to the livelihood threats. So the perception also is driven by that, and hence adaptation to extreme events is separable. That is what I was talking about, the flood. Though these events temporarily alters the long-term trends to climate change. Now to elaborate this, if you look at look at this climatic variability, and I'll talk about this a little later, that there is a difference between the small farmer and the large farmer's perception, and large farmers tend to be more sensitive about climate variability, but overall only 23% of the people in a cold desert area which is completely fed by glacial meltwater. And we have this knowledge that glaciers are melting. They also have the knowledge. But when you are looking at the livelihood threat, the factors that they are identifying is really land degradation. Pests, some people have said that yes, this could be because of increase of temperature, but very, very few. Roadblocks is, congestion of road is one of the main things. So they said that diversification is risky, which I showed before, and these are the reasons that they are really looking at. Proposition 5. Perceptions of climate change in the same village micro-location can be differentiated. Within villages can be differentiated, and they're differentiated by gender and other social contexts, as also economic groups and occupation. So the same climate change, and this is another way we should challenge the naturalness and ubiquitousness of a disaster. It is not. So even within the micro context, and this completely intersects with the way people are living their individual life, that would decide what your perception is. So, an interesting thing. Now, in Himachal, everybody would be conversant that in hilly areas, both the spaces that I'm talking about, women do a huge amount of agricultural work. So almost 80% of the work is done by the women, the agricultural labor. So at least my first cut, hypothesis was that the women would be more aware of the climatic change because they're doing all the agricultural work. They will see how frost is changing their productivity. They will see when the crops are flowering, how much they're growing, and exactly that. But the results that we saw, other than a few indicators which are not important anyway, which I've colored, actually women's viewpoint towards climate change is more muted than that of men. Much more men have said that, look, the climate change has taken place in this way. This is another way of, this of course is separated, and we subsequently also asked them to connect it with the productivity. Even then we got the same results. So you can see all these red places where I've done red and green, where the women version is much more, sense is much more muted, which is contrary to what we hypothesized. Now, when we went into the details of it, and I'll come to that, it is a question of agency. I will talk about this. It is not about knowledge, because women have far more knowledge and grass-rooted knowledge in this particular space so far as agriculture and its interaction with climate is concerned. So that is not something which is driving their perception. This is another example I'm giving from Brahmaputra, that the flood is completely differently viewed say, by the Mishing tribe, and I'm talking about Middle Assam here near the Majuli Island, where the Mishing tribe who live almost on the river, they look at flood as a welcome change because one of their main occupation is fishing, and when the floods happen, they get much more fish. This is a photograph of Mishing women who are fishing for their self-consumption need, and men actually do the fishing which is sold in the market. So there is this division of labor. They do the same work, slightly different technology, but one is for self-consumption, the other is for selling in the market, and I'll come to this later. And the landed people who are doing agriculture are completely look on flood as an unmitigated disaster. So the issue of embankment, which is very common in the Brahmaputra Valley, that there are the structural changes which have now, there's a lot of critique for it. The Mishing tribes completely opposed the embankments. So there were, ground narratives where Mishing tribes, most often men, have actually broken the embankment so that the water can come, and they have been embraced by the landed peasants, particularly those who are closer to the river, because that they think that it is really stopping. But I'm not going into this, but we also found that embankments are also a reason. So which side the embankment is, it actually enhances erosion on the other side, and this is even irrespective of the ethnicity difference. The villages after villages are washed away. So that is another element. So that viewpoint I have not brought in here, but that's also important. Proposition 6, agencies are important for climate resilient behaviors. Knowledge is not adequate. And this I'm drawing from my last example. Now I want to, through a photograph of Himachal, I want to just show you that you can see women, whether it is collecting fodder fuel, whether it is agriculture, harvesting, this is harvesting, this is sowing, this is carrying, I mean, the two women just delivered lunch to the other women who are working. This is collection of both children, all are women. You can only see women working, whether it is agricultural work, whether it is allied work. When you look at the marketing of peas and potato, can you see a woman here? I mean, when I took the photograph, this is a woman who's looking on. She's not participating. She had come for some other work. So the gender division is so stark. So this is what I call as, this is one of the things where the cash economy is completely linked with is gendered. So the work is entirely done by the women. And when we did some detailed qualitative interviews to understand why women do not readily react to climate change, they just said that we are so busy all the time, the household work, this work, we have no time to think. And even if the climate, there is any change which is happening, we have to struggle with it anyway. So why think about it? So it is their way of coping with this abnormal burden of work, which is in fact far, far more than we see in the plains where the gender division of work is slightly different. So this is the kind of agency that I'm talking about. Same example that I have given you about the Mishing women and Mishing men, one who is related to the cash economy, other who does the same occupation for self-consumption. This is from Brahmaputra Valley. So in Bhutan, there is, I mean, of course, these photographs don't say anything, but this is a woman I interviewed. And in Bhutan, contrary to all other spaces that we have studied, traditionally the land was given to the daughters, not the sons. So investments were made for sons to get educated. So they are more in the service sector, and women have access to land. They also take care of their parents, and the house property, that is the parental house property, is given to the daughter who's looking after the parents. So there is a rationale to it. Now this woman, even though I did not understand and this interview had to be translated, she knew almost everything, the kind of decision she was making with the river down, very difficult ones. I don't have the time to go into this, was a far cry from, say, for example, this woman I'll talk about later. This is again in the hills in Pasighat in Arunachal. These are well-educated women, but they said that when there are Gram Sabha meeting, we have no voice. So if some of us talk, because we are as educated, sometimes more educated than our husbands, we are looked on as, fast women. So here you can't see. So there are a lot of women in the field, but the machine is being handled by a man. So this is also in the hills where there is an alienation from machine so far as women are concerned. This is a woman who was, most of the women had a very, the lower Brahmaputra, lower Assam, had very good knowledge. Again, I'm saying knowledge about flood. But this particular woman actually did some, she worked as a domestic help in a nearby city, and she earned more than her husband. And she was an exception where she took, a lot of the decisions of the household compared to, and we have a film where she features where, sometime we can watch that. That's a very well-made film, which we did from Saki Waters. So she was actually, if you look at her version of her understanding of the flood and her husband's understanding of the flood, hers is far more deep-rooted, and what she wants to do with it, she's very clear about that. Proposition 7, gendered roles and agencies during disasters blurred. This is from Brahmaputra Basin that I've got, but heighten pre and post disasters. I do not have photographs during pre and post disasters so much, but we have narratives. I will answer this because I'm taking a lot of time. So I'll just show you, see here, during the disaster, both men and women are doing the same thing. They're fishing in the flooded water, which is usually not flooded. Here, both girl children and boy children are missing school, and they are in this school building, which is a little up, and they have taken refuge. Here, both the men and the woman are, bathing and taking care of the child, which is not the usual thing. Post-flood, there is a huge scarcity. This is one of the photographs that we have. This I got from one of the journalists there, forgotten to give the photo credit, Mitu Khatanier. So he gave, so the girl children are collecting safe drinking water, walking miles, and they've dropped out of school. And same thing when the flood leaves the house, there's a huge amount of work. The cleaning work is entirely done by the women, who sometimes even when they need to work, they are not able to work because of this huge burden. Proposition 8, cases of adaptation to climate change. Adaptation to climate are numerous, but this is not so to climate change. So I'm making a distinction between climate and climate change. Rarely do people see these changes in livelihoods, strategies as driven by climate change. So, for example, the climate, for example, this is the village which is 6 months under snow, and the willow trees are, so they have their livestock, that is a main source of earning. So they've grown a lot of willow trees, which actually give them fodder. Here, the cattle might eat up so they have actually wrapped these on cloth. This is what they have stored even in common area, and this is what I'm coming to subsequently. There is a lot of collective action in dealing with climate change as well as individual action. This is in summer, they have picked up green leafy vegetables which are dried and kept for the, so these are all adaptations to the climate pattern, but we could really see very little of which they said was an adaptation to climate change. Now I'm going to skip this, I'm taking too much of time, but so what I want to say is that from climate change parameter to risk, to response to risk, to nature of adaptation, out of the 240 people which we interviewed, only 6 people were able to connect this. So it's as sparse, as rare as that. So some were at the community level, some were at the individual level, but they did not directly look at their adaptation as climate change. I'm also going to skip this. Proposition 9, institutional responses to livelihood risk is fairly strong in the Himalayan region. Many times these are informal community level institutions, and this is a space where there are low levels of inequality and cohesive society. This is rare in Assam, where class, caste, ethnic hierarchies are heightened. And I give you some examples. This is an area which was completely devoid of trees because the tree was deforested to make the houses. The Mahila Mandal sat together and decided rules about accessing, and they banned people from going there, which everybody listened to. They are so now you can see, when we went, you can see trees are being regenerated. So this is one of the examples. Pool construction. Pool is a irrigation channel, which is the lifeline of the villages over there. They are connected from glacial melt points to the field. And this is done now. Of course, MGNREGA is there and they get paid for it. But this has been happening historically. So people got together. Every member of the household had to put labor into this. And there was this collective action, which actually enabled them to diversify and bring the water in a cold desert area. This is about water rotation, where, I have not been able to get the entire picture, but there is a box in which there are numbers written. So this little girl has picked up the numbers on the one hand and names were in the other box. And that was accepted by the rest of the society. Okay, the rotation of the water will be like this. So these are all forms of dealing with natural resources in a sustainable manner at the grassroots level. And you observe this kind of institutions. I mean, from my very, very limited 2 examples, there could be many, many more examples from other and deviating examples like this. But you see that institutions are quite strong. And even though I cannot link these institutions to climate change, in my considered opinion, these are institutions which will also enable them to deal with risks of climate change of any kind, because this is the base of the society. These are other examples. This is, for example, exchange labor. So in an economy where cash is less, they do each other's work. And this is also because of social cohesion. So there has to be some amount of trust. Again, you see women exchanging labor. So you come and harvest my field or sow my field. I will go tomorrow to sow your field. So there is a shortage of labor. This is not a densely populated area. And there is a scarcity of cash where they are making do with exchange labor. This is also, to my mind, an example of institution, social institution. So we did some kind of a quantitative analysis where we did this 5 pentagons and we tried to measure it in some way, not very satisfactorily. But the thing I would point out here is, and this is something, same method we had earlier with one of my students who had done her PhD, subsequently was associated with Saki Waters also. In her thesis also, we got similar results, that the human capital, which is education and skill, financial capital, natural capital, which is access to land and other sources of water, which is in terms of ownership, physical is infrastructure, social is how much of network do you have. What we see is that expectedly the poor are doing much worse in all of these, and that is why they're poor, but they're somewhat trying to make up with it in terms of social network. And I am stressing on this here. Of course, the values are not too different, but I'm stressing on this because this is the second time we got a result like this. So, I mean, my observation is that the poor try to make up with social network, like that exchange labor that I gave you an example of. There are many other examples of which I have not quoted here. So they get together and hire one person to graze all their cattle together, and they pitch in and pay it. So there are many, many examples of this. So I'm going to, so now in sum, so these are the propositions. So what have I deduced from here? Number one, local contexts are important. Hence, decentralization is desirable. This is something Ashish was also talking about. Elevating livelihoods is a primary basis to expect climate change sensitive behavior. If they are at the threshold level, don't expect them to adopt a behavior which veers towards climate change sensitive behavior if it is in conflict with what you are earning. And we see this difference in developed countries and developing countries in terms of the kind of technology which is being used. A two-way interaction, there has to be a two-way interaction with people's knowledge and science. So there has to be a common language. I'm not talking about the language and the literary sense, but common language where they understand each other. So don't throw away the perception. They are important. Science and scientific data is also important. We have to figure out a way in which there is a constant engagement between these two. You have to take a holistic view of adaptation. Don't look at climate change adaptation. So we have to expand it and look at adaptation in favor of threats to livelihood, where climate change can be incorporated as a causal link. And then some research can be done towards that exactly in what ways. And then communicate it to the ground. Otherwise, nothing is going to happen. Towards equality and better distribution of resource, we have seen when we talked about the gender thing, the Bhutan example and the Lower Valley example, which I had talked about in the first proposition about genderscape. There has to be a more favorable gender distribution of work, better distribution of resources in terms of land, access to water, equality at large if women are to be equal partner in sustainability stewardship. And the last, from the social capital result that I have, I want to say that putting poor and women at the center, not of responsibility only, which many of the development projects funded externally do, but with the power. So you have to give them the power to decide, and because their social capital, they use their social capital far more to overcome their problems. They are, in my opinion, they would actually do better in terms of managing local level institutions if you give them the power. So these are the things which I was talking about. I will just take 2 minutes to go through the, we have done, what I've done here is 2 sets of policies, national policies. One is the water policy from 1984 to current, and the climate change policy from late 90s to current. Now there are 4 things which I have shown. One is if you do a content analysis of this document, you will see that there is an overarching pro-environment narrative. So, the need to connecting surface and groundwater, diversification of water resources, demand management, and so on and so forth is filled. The documents are filled with it. But at the same time, it also says that there is an increasing need, and this is also in an increasing manner, that there is an increased need for financial sustainability where water rates would cover the fixed and variable costs. But at the same time, I've forgotten to put this in the graph. At the same time, there is a conflicting statement in each of the policy, at least the water policy documents, that it is the state's responsibility to provide drinking water and domestic water, which is conflicting with this. So here, therefore, in terms of verbosity, it is the state responsibility. In terms of the nitty-gritties, water is seen as economic goods. If there is a state withdrawal, increased privatization. And there is one thing which is consistent with, you know, which seems to be at conflict with, not seems to be in consonance with the pro-environment thing, that in over the period of time, both in the climate change document and in the water documents, you see that increasingly responsibilities are being transferred to the community-based organizations and the local governments. But if you look through the line, so you would say this is good, but this is about the point I was making, that responsibilities are given, powers are not given. So look at the, which your organization only has, you know, organized the panel discussion, which I was happy to be a part of, on EIA. If you remember that, you know, you know what you, so this is also a way in which you can interpret the word Atmanirbhar, which is being used today. Atmanirbhar is only that the responsibility of yours, but the power is not there. So this is the same if you read beyond the line. So it is actually conflicting with this, though it appears to be in consonance. And social justice and equity issue and gender issues have just been stagnant. They have been copied, and this I can say with a lot of confidence, that they have been copied and pasted from one document to the other. So there is practically no change in which none of the issues, which at least I'm not saying what I've brought up is the only important thing, but a lot of things which are based on grounded research, grounded work, they don't seem to be addressing that at all. So this is where I had some other things, but this is where I would like to end. I am really sorry I've taken up a whole lot of time.
Thank you very much, ma'am. In fact, it was your presentation was so enthralling that it was as if attending your class, and thank you very much. You have put forward so many ideas and propositions, and each of these have policy solutions to climate change at the local level and to develop a whole country-wide policy altogether. So thank you very much for your presentation once again. I would like to pose to you a few questions that, according to me, stood out, and perhaps if you could throw some more light on this. First is, you know, I study food security, global food security very closely, and very recently we have seen how the Global Hunger Index 2020 was released, and India ranks 94th out of 107 countries,
Yes.
which is a very, very deplorable rank. And we are in the serious category of hunger. So you pointed out that the whole production and selling of production and sale of agricultural commodities, you touched on these aspects. So we can say that you know, climate change has critical ramifications on food security of the country. And adaptation actions will perhaps make way for more novel solutions to have climate smart agriculture, or for example, having fortified seeds for ensuring food security among the lower end of the population. What, according to you, is the most effective way to save India from you know, further falling into the further falling in the ranking of Global Hunger Index, so to say? And of course, our need of the hour is to save the people, because this index does not include the impact of the pandemic. So we have seen how starvation has happened despite all the policy schemes, very well policy schemes in place. So your thoughts on this, ma'am?
Yeah, so see, I would, and which I did not touch on this talk, I've only talked about climate change, but I mean, I do a talk on the political economy of sustainable development, I think, which is something, a framework which addresses this much, much better. So I think the kind of model of development that we have adopted is one which has been established by Piketty and many others at the local level. All kinds of studies have shown us and emphatically established that this particular model of development is completely unsustainable in terms of moving towards any form of equality. So on the one hand, you see, so earlier, so I again, I'm going back to my class in economic geography, but I mean, so climate change actually comes as a additional shock to this. But I think the base is the kind of development model that we are following across the globe. And so initially you have this thing of people earning greater profit because they have access to greater means, taking advantage of the economies of scale, that in the initial period, and which people thought, I mean, that was acceptable by general people, so general narrative. So the inequality deepened as a result of that. But if you look at Harvey's contradictions in capitalism, he points out that this route of getting higher and higher profit, and this being a route of accumulation of wealth in a few hands and taking away from other, has a second, because the capitalism will at one point of time stop earning profits or get at least saturated from this route. So the second thing is what he calls as accumulation by dispossession, which is completely taking away the resources from the poor, which we have seen and discussed in terms of the EIA. So you see, so the second point here is that it's not only about the corporates and the people, because you would expect the corporate to engage in a profit-making behavior. That's the rationale of existence. But the main thing is the relationship of the state, any state, the nation state, and which way it sides. And when we were discussing, I mean, again, I'm bringing it because I've discussed it here, in the Environment Impact Assessment 2020, we've seen that the state has completely sided with the corporate and against the people. So it has disempowered the people, disempowered that decision-making power. And this is just one example. There are multiple ways in which it happens. Now, the additional thing which I would like to relate with climate change is that poor and women within that, and different sections of deprived social groups depend on natural resources much more than the rich. So if something happens directly to the natural resources, it is them who are at the receiving end primarily. So think of a situation where you are, instead of empowering them, you are taking the state, because the state is responsible, because it's a democracy and everybody is voting for that. And the number of people who are poor is much more. So the state, then you have to really question the state's action in terms of what I mean, now the steps are not even hidden in words. They are just out there for you to see as to how people, the common people, are being alienated. And I can only, we knew that there was an economic crisis ahead of the pandemic. I shudder to think a lot of data is not available to us now. Shudder to think what is going to happen as a result of this and how long that is going to last. So the hunger index, if you say anything, I think if you ask me, it looks impossible for me to reverse this, because I feel short of changing the paradigm of development, you cannot reverse this. You will only make it worse. And climate change, the way we are going, where majority of the country, like USA, like many other countries, are just throwing away the element of climate change or the science behind the climate change and refusing to recognize what is going to happen. That also has, I think, something to do with the rich not getting so affected by it. So I shudder to think as to what COVID, climate change as multiplier effects adds up to this larger development model, which, I mean, COVID and this thing also is a outcome of our development model. So I really have very little hope other than a complete reversal of the way you are looking at the development strategy, complete reversal. putting labor at the
Absolutely.
center, putting, you know, the deprived at the center, putting the majority at the center and making them count.
Sure, sure.
Which is inverse of
Absolutely.
what is happening. So I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but really I'm not
No,
able to
this
see
is
light now.
actually a matter of fact, because especially when we see that so smartly the US has walked out of the Paris Agreement and does not want
Yes,
to be responsible for any of its deeds that it is
right.
undertaking. So closely related to your response now, ma'am, is my next question to you. You've shown through the use of photographs, and it was so wonderful how women are actually doing the less profitable work, yeah, in the farms, and which is being monetized by the men. You showed the photograph that a woman is watching the sale or marketing of the products. This is in no disaster time. For example, it is in the normal
Mm,
time when everything is
mm,
okay. You have also pointed out that during the disasters, women join hands and work in tandem with men to deal with the
right,
situation.
right.
So, I am compelled to draw a parallel with these photographs with the colonization of India, where the British coerced the Indians to do the manual and the manual labor, and then extract the monetary benefits out of the sale of it. Similarly, when the disasters struck, for example, the Second World War, First and the Second World War, they recruited Indians without their knowledge, with or without their knowledge, to fight on their behalf. So, does this behavior, ma'am, as shown in the photographs by you, does it really show a colonial male mentality, which is continuing till date, and which is being specially concretized during these extreme environmental events? Again, referring to your power responsibility contradiction.
Mm. It's very interesting the way you have put the question, and I really commend you for that. But if I have to be very, I mean, based on, because I had conducted many of these interviews myself, I did not think so. So one of the things that I came up in the genderscape study was that when we are talking about this issue of gender, we talk in binaries. You have to talk about intersectional reality. So many of these men are also very poor. They are also so if you push the gender agenda too far, you will leave behind the poor men who are also very deprived. So the kind of photographs that I showed are all from families who do not have a pakka house, who are making in a makeshift, staying in a makeshift house, who are living in chores meaning the impermanent riverine islands, and constantly have to shift from one place to the other. There also you see a gender division. It's not as if you don't. But they are, I feel that the gender relation in a poverty situation is much more diluted. So the joining of hands that we saw during the crisis, I did not think it was, I think it was just a joint endeavor to overcome the crisis where the social norms were diluted. So I don't see it in that, though I find the way you've positioned the question really, really interesting. But I think in this case, we have to remember the intersectional reality. So by pushing women's agenda too far, we should not leave behind poor men. And these were all contexts of that.
Sure. Thank you very much, ma'am. The next question is about environment being a common property resource. It is a resource for the rich, for the poor, for the nations alike, for
Right.
everybody. But we have also seen, as and also pointed out by you, that the global north has appropriated the environment for its own benefits to the exclusion of the lower income countries.
Right.
And to the and in the lower income countries, the lower income population have been sidelined or marginalized. So this is certainly a justice issue, as you pointed out right from the beginning. It is a justice issue. people have actually called for intensifying the investment as low carbon rural development, or only focusing on what the needs of the rural areas are, and then do the adaptation and mitigation efforts accordingly. But does this also mean that we are allowing the urban spaces to continue with their modernization techniques while ensuring that the rural areas continue with their traditional ways of life? Wouldn't this intensify the regional inequalities, and have of course when you rightly said, it would socialize the costs and privatize the benefits?
Yeah, very good question again. So again, I would like to point out that this is also, this answer to this question, at least my perspective to this question, is rooted in the political economy of the current model of development, where how are the countries achieving growth? Let us think about that. Countries are achieving growth. We have made capital very, very mobile. We have not made labor very mobile. We have made labor mobile within the countries to that extent, because you need migration. But capitals are far more mobile than moving across the country. So you are having foreign direct investments. You have huge, all over the place. I mean, so you have Indian big capitalists also investing overseas, and you have other people, and there is domestic capital. Now, where is all of this capital going? They're going, for the most part, for example, Sanjay Chakravarti's article, I mean, subsequent ones also actually talks about, the location. Others also talk about this, that the coastal zones and the large metropolitan city, the peripheral area of that, consumes 80% of this investment. This is a little dated, but I mean, I would suspect that has only become worse than 80%. This you see, again, I'm bringing in the EIA here because that is in my mind. In EIA, what did we see? We saw that the one of the activity which needs no EIA are the constructions, if you remember. So those constructions are primarily being done to expand the urban areas, right? So one issue is a labor issue, that you have these investments, now you need cheap labor. So the cost of production, in fact, the current post-Fortis model, the maximum that you are saving is through the labor. And if you have to depress the wage rates, you can't have a booming agriculture, because if you have a booming agriculture, people are going to earn well within their rural domain. There'll be no push migration. We have a Hindi term for it, palayan, that is, I feel, very apt, is fleeing. So you make it so depressed, and that is what the reason of the continuing agrarian distress. So what you see, and the example I gave through EIA, is in my sense. Our current development model is supporting the depression of the rural by investing it less and less. The three last agricultural bills that you saw, which a lot of debate has happened, where, the first and foremost, so they are encouraging contract farming, but the most important thing is the minimum support price is the APMC is being done away with. I mean, that is what is going to happen over a period of time. So farmers are already not getting good prices. These were only concentrated in Punjab and Haryana. Instead of taking this to the rest of the country so that the other farmers get good price, you are actually eliminating this Western UP, Punjab, Haryana farmers also. So what you will really see, the way we are going, we will have a huge army of surplus labor who will not get, there is not enough employment for them. The wage rates are going to come down. So you are going to see, and that is the axis through which profits will be earned. So this essentially, within it, has embedded the regional differences between the rural and the urban, what you were talking about.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for putting it so coherently. My last question to you before I invite Dr. Arjun Kumar is that is India a solution to the problem of climate change or a problem to the solution of climate change? I'll, I'll put it again. Is India a solution to the problem of climate change or a problem to the solution? Your perspectives. I mean, this
Miss,
has
I
really bothered
also
me for quite some time. So
Yeah, well,
as a
I
teacher.
find it hard to answer this because it could be a solution, it is not. Uh, because particularly, again, I'm referring to Ashish's talk, where he's given so many examples at the grassroots level, not in India, worldwide also, but if you're talking about India, there are many, so-called sustainable communities from whom we can learn lessons. And we are not. I mean, I'm looking at the like did the policy part very briefly, but if we look at even the earlier, the thing was the real intent of the policy was hidden by good words. Now it's not even that. So I don't think it can be a solution. It has a potential to be a solution, but I don't think it's doing. And I do not see, in terms of the north-south divide, I really feel the climate injustice. In the climate injustice, I would see India at the receiving end, because we are having to, all the developing countries are having to pay the price for what the developed nations have done. But within India and within our community, there is a, I mean, it's like Ashish was saying yesterday, I mean, that day, that the global north is also rich people in India. So within India also you have a global north and global south. So I don't think I think equality, moving towards equality is the key word in climate sustainability. Unless and until we do this, we will only be a problem.
Correct, absolutely. Unless we move towards an equal society, in the sense, then only we'll be able to harness the
so what is the most unsustainable is the unequal society.
True.
It's the central part of unsustainability.
Yes. Absolutely. Thank you very much, ma'am. I now invite Dr. Arjun to come on the screen. Yes, and to pose your questions, and in brief, because we are already delayed. Arjun, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. In fact, equality is also required for economic growth, so that it translates. I really wanted to add on what Simi asked about what India is, but on paper and in the international standard and everywhere, also our Prime Minister is leading it. India is champion for the climate change. We also have a biennial update review. Two reports came, and even in that report, we are lacking in the forest, even what our minister have now given. So on paper, we remain the champion in the world. Thank you very much, Professor Sen, for putting forth such a vast topic, given almost more than an hour talk. Very insightful, using so many pictures. Few things which I have really want to ask also from ma'am, that one thing what also CSRD has taught us, we look into the aspect from economic, social, and other issues, but ma'am is really highlighting that the locational disadvantage as one of the core factors. And in our socioeconomic analysis, I and many of our researchers also used the issue of socio-spatial inequality or poverty. So the location also becomes important. This we really have done into urban, informal places and slums. We also did a project for IGC. We looked into slum formation to Bihar. But ma'am has really highlighted that in coastal areas, in also in the hill areas, how location is important. And ma'am has looked into the third intersection, also gender, then caste and economic factors. Then also this location is very important thing. Ma'am, given this I really, ma'am, you also showed that all India map where you showed the gender, that the Gangetic Plain has more of a gender inequity. What, in your sense, is happening with those regions historically, or what are the factors that this region remains the poor? Also, these are the Bimaru states. Also, for gender equity perspective, what in your view are the reasons? And then ma'am has also given so many of propositions, and rightly being also critical of those. For example, in one proposition, ma'am has really seen that the women are not acknowledging the climate change. And then ma'am has also looked into that the gender division of work. We also did a big survey, around 5,000 responses we did last month, of village makers, rural women. There also we are trying to look into the time use and paid, unpaid care work. Maybe perhaps ma'am will share it with you. And lastly, ma'am has highlighted that whether the policies are convergent or contradictory, and ma'am has also suggested so many things. And one of the key finding ma'am is suggesting is that the access to land and resources for the women. And then coming forth to two important things: decentralization and also the role of data, spatial data, of course. And the tough task really is to look into the gender dimension of the maybe decentralization or data. And ma'am is also highlighting that the empowerment part especially is missing. So ma'am, what in your view, from also the gender point of view, since it's also climate change, so many dimensions are coming, how a decentralized and data thing, but really if the empowerment can be done given this scenario, what are the way ahead which let us say our Bimaru belt can learn from our other areas, in your view? Thank you again so much, ma'am, for giving such a wonderful
Okay, thanks Arjun. So I feel that of course there has to be gender focused understanding, and an understanding that gender is only one of the axis of inequality, and that it is very complex and complicated. So for example, if you look at the farmer suicide, of course the data is not very satisfactory, but and there is undercounting of women suicide. The way they are categorized is different. But having said that, it is a reality that more of the men farmers are committing suicide. So what I'm trying to say is that gender has to be understood in a very sensitive, in a nuanced manner. And so there could be, and there needs to be this understanding and, policies coming out directly from it. But what I feel is that, again, I'm coming back to the same thing. To my mind, two different things have to be done, which I find all the policies are going against it. One, both I have highlighted while I was answering Simi's questions. And I think a lot of the gender inequality will be sorted out even without specifically looking at gender. The first is correct the imbalance between the urban and the rural, agriculture and non-agriculture. Most of the women are based, the percentage of women worker in agriculture is much higher. Among the total women workers, there's a higher percentage of women depending on agriculture. Once you do this, there is going to be a different kind of I'm not saying that you should not be doing gender specific, but these are the two basic things you have to do. Second, give primacy to labor vis-a-vis capital. And if the state does not do it in a democratic country, I don't know who will. Because the labor is more numerous. You are accountable to the majority of your people. So I really also do not understand when journalists and media houses say this is a populist measure. What is a populist measure? Populist measure is that measure which majority of the people will like. That's okay. That's fine. Why is it a gali? Why are you running down somebody the moment you say you're giving subsidies or you're waiving a farmer's loan? You're saying it's a populist measure. Of course it is, and that's how it should be. I mean, democracy works like that. So you should do actions which works for majority of the people. And, you know, the pandemic has shown us the kind of, so the earlier international documents have actually told us that it's okay for the wealth being concentrated around the cities. That will create job, people will migrate, and that will equal out the wage rates. During the pandemic, you show, I mean, was lived out that how fallacious this is. You have created such vulnerable urban workplaces. So it's not as if people you have taken from agriculture to work in the cities by devoiding it agriculture of any productive work, they are pushed there. But what kind of life you are giving them? They don't have 15 days of savings. They are starving after you've closed their down for 15 days. So I feel that I will again look at inequality from a holistic aspect, gender being one of the important axes. While that has to be tackled separately, it should not be a checkbox that we have. Nowadays, it's popular among policymakers that, okay, I've done gender, check, which it actually does not do. So if I'm talking about gender, if I'm inserting the term gender, I'm done. But it has to be done at its root. So we have to address inequality holistically, understanding that gender is one of the dimensions there. So if these two things are done, they are the base according to me. After that, we move towards policies specifically that help, say, Dalits, that help Muslims, that help women. So that's how I should go. But the basic is capital labor relationship change, rural urban relationship change. These are the two basic things which needs to be done. And I work, currently I'm working on gender, but I don't see it in relation from the larger inequality position.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for responding to those questions and comments. Thank you again for joining us today in the morning. And your talk has clearly pointed out that the most vulnerable to climate change are the poor in India, poor, marginalized, and that includes women, children, elderly, the transgenders, and other lower income groups. And unfortunately, their assets and livelihoods are, tied to climate sensitive factors of production. This is quite unfortunate. So therefore, I take this as a takeaway point that greater policy and bureaucratic attention is needed in order to diversify the livelihoods, the opportunities, and thereby reduce the vulnerability, because climate change is here to stay, and it is definitely going to have massive ramifications across all the sectors and for all the people. I mean, even if it is, if the rich are enjoying the fruits of climate change in terms of increased agricultural productivity, the rich nations, but still down the line, in over a period of some decades, definitely they'll be facing the brunt. So definitely a concerted action is required, and international agreements and responsibility to fulfill those agreements, and your own work that the country's own work that has been put forth in these agreements need to be really concretized and solidified. So with these few words, thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us today, and we look forward to having more detailed discussion with you on another topic, perhaps on the political economy of sustainable development, which
Yeah,
you
sure.
have pointed out during the course of this discussion. I'm sorry?
Ma'am was mentioning one topic before. Yes.
Okay. So yes, with these few words, I thank all the audience on Facebook Live and on Zoom, and India Water Portal, Terry School of Advanced Studies, and Team IMPRI for being so supportive. Thank you, thank you very much. Have a very good day,
Thank
ma'am.
you, Simi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun.
Yes, have a good day, ma'am.
Thank you. Have a good day.